Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about something that's doing the rounds at the moment, the idea of the living constitution. The idea that the US, in this case, the US Constitution, and the activists and the globalists are sort of working in tandem here with, the usual suspects, the mainstream media owned by the globalists, various politicians, AOC and anyone with an IQ of sort of less than 80 seems to like this idea. But the living constitutions, let's just have a look at that as a concept. Now, some of the sort of arguments, excuses or propaganda, call it what you will, that are being put about to say the Constitution should evolve over time. Laws should evolve, and therefore laws or framework laws, which the Constitution really is, should adapt to changing conditions and circumstances over time. So let's just look at that. Now, we need to separate sort of framework laws, which is the Constitution. All men are created equal before God, for example. Now that's the government of the United States shall pass no law that inhibits freedom of worship. These are kind of big ticket, overarching framework type. I'm not sure you'd call them laws per se, but the framework conditions of government. Government must adhere to in the Constitution. Government must adhere to the following rules and guidelines and principles and so on. So that's what a constitution is and what framework laws are. Now, detail laws, such as if you've got 100 pounds of fentanyl in your the boot of your car, then you're a drug dealer, for example, and there are certain penalties specific to, say, the amount of fentanyl you have, whether you're a repeat offender, and so on. So they're very specific laws. Now, they will evolve and should evolve over time. Fentanyl didn't exist 100 years ago, for example. Therefore, laws exist today to specifically deal with that issue that's current, whereas laws wouldn't have existed 100 or 200 or 300 years ago because fentanyl didn't exist and drug dealing in the sense and consumption that we see today didn't exist. So we can see laws that are very specific to a physical set of circumstances that may no longer exist. Now, the comeback is, for example, with the Constitution, that the Congress shall pass no laws that inhibit freedom of worship. Some people come back and say, well, back in those days, people believed in the immortal soul. There was a lot of what today we would call extremely pious people engaging in quite rigorous religious observance. And today you don't have that as much, or not as many people are concerned about it or practice it. And so therefore, that framework of the Congress shall not inhibit freedom of worship or prevent it, that should no longer apply in as much as it's not necessary. Well, what would replace it? So we need to separate framework laws from specific laws. Now, let's sort of go back even further to say, because the laws in the United States came from British laws. The time of the Declaration of Independence, British citizens and by extension British colonists, which is what they were at the time, were the freest people in the world. British citizens and the American colonists were the freest people in the world. Now, you may say, well, look at the freedom, representation of tax. Yeah, you may say, but that's an issue to discuss. But compared to anyone else out there on a relative basis, British citizens enjoyed the most freedoms and the most protections under the law. So the Constitution was conceived and written on the basis of those freedoms which British citizens took for granted, and by extension, of course, the colonists. Now, there's quibbling about again, taxation without representation and that sort of stuff. But in terms of the the basic laws and liberties and so on, then British people and the American colonists were the freest in the world. So there was, and you can see in the Constitution, the framers of Jefferson, Madison, and those guys, they had an expectation that those freedoms were natural rights. Whereas if you would go to some other place in the world at that same time, the people would have looked at you and go, what rights? Are you kidding me? I don't have those rights. We don't have those rights. So it was a unique expectation of liberty that was from that British, the wider British sphere of laws and representatives in Parliament and constitutional monarchy in the case of the King. Bear in mind, it was only 120, 30 years previous that the British Parliament had decided to actually execute the King, for Christ's sakes, to cut the dude's head off. In a public execution, guys swinging axes, the whole 9 yards. So the idea of the supremacy of Parliament and of the representatives of the people was something that was no longer being disputed, and that again is a backdrop to the Constitution. But coming back to the living constitution, when you have framework laws that are basic in the sense of all men are created equal before God, that type of thing, those are broad concepts in some ways, and there have been amendments to the Constitution, but they're frameworks. The Congress will not prevent freedom of speech and things like that. And I'm not quoting it, by the way. That's me paraphrasing it, but those are a fairly broad, instructive requirements that the government must meet, but they're not specific laws. So if we go back into England, specific laws were that you can't drive a herd of pigs or livestock over London Bridge on certain days and at certain times. Now, you could say, well, that law is no longer used, but there was a lot of farmland around London Bridge. A lot of people were running livestock, cattle, pigs, and sheep and whatever else. So it was a relevant law to those times and circumstances and conditions. And when laws are that specific in their detail, the micro detail, that at 10 o'clock in the morning you will not have pigs on this bridge at that day, on this time, and that season, and that, then those laws can be changed or go into disuse, as indeed that law was. I think it was something like 1200 AD, or maybe even a bit earlier than that. So laws can fall into disuse in as much as they're no longer relevant. Similarly, laws change purely on the basis of technology. There were laws about how many way stations in some states and regions there were for feeding horses that were necessary for transporting mail or government business. They fall into disuse because obviously horses aren't used anymore. Airplanes or cars or motorbikes, couriers. The machinery is now used to do that. So those things have changed. So when you get that level of detail, sure, they change, and sure, those laws evolve and change with particularly changing technology. But let's have a look at people, the aspirations, and we've got historians, we've got historical records, patchy, but enough of them, that go back thousands of years, 3,000 years or so. So we can look at what the ancient Greeks were thinking and how they behaved and what they said and what they did, their aspirations, their dreams, their laws, the whole thing from 2,500 years ago. We've got a diary from an exchange between a guy and his wife in the Middle East, in I think what would be modern day Iraq, but the city of the port city of Basra, which was like a big sea, big trading port back in the day, from 3,000 years ago. We've got the Roman Senate, their discussions in the Roman Senate from 2,000 years ago. And we've got all sorts of references to the type of things that concern citizens, concern politicians, concern the people that long ago, and nothing's changed. People, their aspirations, their dreams, their concerns, their worries, their fears, they're exactly the same today as they were 3,000 years ago. Nothing has changed. Technology's changed, sure, but people haven't changed, and their attitudes, as I say, their concerns haven't changed. So the fact that the Congress, the Declaration of Independence, and the documentation that came from that, the Constitution of the United States, and later on the French Revolution, for example, the Declaration of Rights of Man, that sort of stuff, those things reflected the concerns of people in a sense that will be around with us unless we're all turned into robots, which again is a technological adaptation. These are concerns that people have had throughout history. The desire for freedom, liberty, representative government, freedom of worship, freedom of association, freedom of thought. These are time immemorial. They've been around. So, and these are reflected and encapsulated in the Constitution. So the idea of the Constitution, the living Constitution, when it's written with those broad concepts and concerns and applications of government power, then we need to sort of take that into account. That is not a living constitution, because those concerns, those issues are human beings from time immemorial, and it will continue. Another 1,000 years from now, people will still want freedom of worship, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, all this sort of thing. And that's what the American Constitution captured. And so it's not a living constitution. It is a reflection of thousands of years of history of concerns, and is as poignant today as it was when it was written, as indeed it would have been if it had been written 1,000 years before that. So let's just go back over, and I encourage people listening to this live stream to read widely. If we look at, say, and there was, and you can Google this one, but there was in Basra, there was a guy, he was off in business in Basra, but his wife was still at home in some other city, and she wrote to him complaining about a woman who'd had her house renovated. Now, bear in mind, this is 3,000 years ago, her house renovated. And she was down at the market boasting and skiting about how good her house was. And this was driving this guy's wife insane with jealousy and so on. So she wrote a letter to him and said, look, I want to renovate this house, our house, just to shut her up, because she won't stop boasting and carrying on about how good her fucking renovated house is. So she sends him a letter saying, I want to renovate the house. Can you send me some money, or can you tell the builder to come and fix the place up? And so he writes back saying, why does that matter? Forget about that stupid woman. Are you trying to send me bankrupt? What are you doing? What's all this? So this was 3,000 years ago, and that could be a conversation that would have happened in any household, 1,000 years after that, another 1,000 years, or even today. So people haven't changed in that sense. If we look at as a historian, an ancient Greek historian called Thucydides, and he wrote a book, or a book that was compiled subsequently, called The Peloponnesian War. You can buy it online from Amazon, or you may be able to find it at some secondhand bookshops. So Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, and he goes through the discussions that the various Greek city-states had back in the day, Athens and Sparta and Corinth and Thebes and whatever. The discussions they had and the negotiations they had about warfare, about trade, about all sorts of things, and the logic they apply, the reasoning, how they reach conclusions, the agreements they make. We'll give you this if you give us that. It's exactly the same. I mean, I've sat in meetings that were exactly the same. So human rationale and reasoning, the things they're concerned about, the petty jealousies and pride, all this sort of thing, are exactly the same today as they were 2,500 years ago. Again, people haven't changed. If we look at the Roman Senate, and if you read Pliny, Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius, there's a range of Livy, Livy. There's a range of historians from those times where some of their works survives. Yes, Seneca. The list goes on. There's quite a few of the Roman historians where part of their works at least have survived. So we can see the sort of discussions that the Roman senators had, their concerns, the laws they were trying to bring in to say, limit fire. They had special fire officers to go around to make sure that people weren't lighting dangerous fires to, particularly say street vendors cooking food, things like that. So all the concerns of the Senate and the how they were framing the laws, the debates they had, the concerns they had, and so on. Again, nothing's changed. We can see diaries from ancient Pompeii. That's the place that was covered in lava from the eruption of that volcano, Mount Vesuvius. And so diaries have been dug up from there. And there's a guy with a diary who's complaining about how the local property developers are bribing local government officials. I mean, again, exactly the same as you see today. There's another diary was dug up about a man who's complaining that his daughter spends too much time in the markets gossiping with her girlfriends. And using his favourite slave to go and run messages to the girlfriends and run back with the reply from the girlfriends, same as as teenage girls on the phone today. And instead they're using the slave, and the poor old slave is exhausted and can't do any work. And so the guy's complaining that his wife spends too much time in the shops buying pairs of shoes. He's complaining that his son spends too much time carousing the bars and the pubs and drinking cocktails and chasing cocktail waitresses, and he's not spending enough time on his studies, and he's turning to a wasteful, all these sorts of things. These are exactly the things that parents are concerned about today and will talk about today, and families will talk about today. So nothing's changed over those thousands of years. Nothing. So the concerns about, again, freedom, liberty, and freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and conscience worship that are enshrined in the US Constitution are absolute bedrock human concerns. And the idea that those things are a living constitution and evolve is bullshit, total bullshit. Sure, micro laws such as the running of pigs across London Bridge, or the amount of way stations for the Pony Express to deliver mail, those things have changed, of course, because technology's changed. But all those other things, those basic human concerns are exactly the same now as they were 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and no doubt 5,000 years ago. We have a better organised situation now in terms of tax revenue to build roads and the like. We've got all that sort of stuff, but the concerns are the same, and so the Constitution is already a reflection and an embodiment of human concerns that will remain so for another 1,000 years, and it should not be changed other than by amendments through the proper constitutional channels, as we've seen in the United States through various amendments. And I don't know how many amendments there are off the top of my head, 20 odd, I think. But and things like the Fifth Amendment and those sort of things, they're realistic things to try and improve the protections and the liberty of the citizens through that constitutional framework, and we should protect that at all costs, in my view. You've been a tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.